My name is Jim Ryan. I'm the Associate Director here at the Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies, and it's a real sincere pleasure for me to welcome you here for today's conference, which began last night with a panel of artists on the theme of creation after destruction, Iraq since 2003. The conference as a whole is built around the theme of Iraq since 2003, beyond turmoil and conflict. The panel we're about to have is themed 2003 and its Afterlives, and features a really excellent collection of area scholars on Iraq. We're really, really excited to have this group of people here today. I'm going to leave it to our graduate student, Zahra Ali, to introduce them, but before I do so, I do want to thank the Departments of History, Middle East and Islamic Studies, and Anthropology for co-sponsoring this conference and making all of this possible. And I do also want to encourage you to stick around, get some more food after the event, but also come join us in the basement lecture hall tonight at 6 p.m. for the keynote lecture for this conference with Dr. Omar Mohammed, who is joining us this afternoon as well. So without any further ado, I want to introduce and thank once again Zahra Ali and Afnan Al-Yafei. They are 2 second years in our MA program here at the Kevorkian Center. This entire conference is their idea. They came to us with the idea for a conference in the spring, built around how we rethink Iraq and Iraq studies since 2003. The reason all of you are here, the reason we're all here, is their brainchild, and I couldn't be happier that we're just here to support them. So without any further ado, please thank Zahra Ali.
Hello everyone, can you hear me in the back? I just wanted to thank, of course, James Ryan, Fidel, Harfusha, and Tandy Badrum, who honestly made this event possible. Without them supporting us from the very crazy idea, then none of us would be here. So really, thank you to them. And I think Afnan and I just sort of wanted to briefly note why we decided to do a conference in the middle of thesis season and applications and everything. I think both in sort of our political and organizing life, we noticed that anytime people would talk about the war in Iraq in 2003, people would sort of leave it at it was a big mistake. And that was sort of the extent of the discussion. And then in the academic, realm, there weren't that many events, about Iraq, despite the fact that there is a flourishing, there's a new sort of newfound focus on Iraq, and thanks to the people on this panel, but also the artists from yesterday and the graduate students from today's graduate workshop. And so we sort of, I think the amount of people that came out today and yesterday is testament to the fact that people want to talk about Iraq and understand it in more nuanced ways, talk about 2003, but also go past that. So now I have the sort of honor of introducing our speakers on this panel. I'm going to do it in order of the speakers. So first we have Sarah Pursley. Sarah Pursley is an assistant professor in the departments of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies and of History at NYU. She is the author of Familiar Futures, Time, Selfhood, and Sovereignty in Iraq, and numerous articles, including most recently, Inequality and the Miracles of the Unconscious. And she's speaking, will also be the moderator for the discussion. And then we have Zahra Ali, who is an assistant professor of sociology at Rutgers. Her research explores dynamics of women and gender, social and political movements in relation to Islam, the Middle East, and contexts of war and conflict with a focus on contemporary Iraq. She is also interested in post-coloniality, decolonial feminisms, and epistemologies. Zahra Ali is the author of Women and Gender in Iraq, Between Nation Building and Fragmentation. Actually, both Professor Pursley and Professor Ali have new books out, so go out and buy them right now. Next we have Omar Dewachi, who also has a pretty recent book. He's an associate professor of anthropology at Rutgers University and is the co-founder and co-director of the Conflict Medicine Program at the American University of Beirut's Global Health Institute. Trained as a physician in Iraq during the 1990s, he received his doctorate in social anthropology from Harvard University in 2008. His work examines the social, medical, and environmental impacts of decades of war and violence in Iraq and the broader Middle East. His book, Ungovernable Life, Mandatory Medicine, and Statecraft in Iraq is the first study documenting the untold story of the rise of state medicine in Iraq under colonial and post-colonial regimes of rule. and the unmaking of state infrastructure under decades of U.S. intervention in the country. He is currently working on an ethnographic project that examines the ecologies of wounds and wounding. We have Omar Sirri, who is a PhD candidate in political science at the University of Toronto. His doctoral dissertation is an ethnography of law and security practices in contemporary Baghdad and the relationship to political economic transformations across the city. He is also an affiliated scholar at the Hassam Faris Institute at the American University of Beirut through 2019. He is also an active member in MESA, so the Middle East Studies Association, and currently serves as a student representative on its board of directors. And last but certainly not least, we have Sinan Antoon, who is a poet, novelist, translator, and associate professor at NYU Gallatin. His teaching and research interests lie in pre-modern and modern Arabic literature and contemporary Arab culture and politics. His scholarly works include the Poetics of the Obscene, Ibn al-Hajjaj, and Suqaf, and numerous essays on the poetry of Mahmoud Darwish, and on contemporary Iraqi culture. So, yeah, with that we can skip.
Okay, is this on? Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Jenna and Ahmad, for organizing this great event. I'm actually not going to talk for that while. I'll time myself just in case I start babbling. I think I'm not going to talk for that long. I talked a lot at a graduate workshop this morning, and I just gave a talk here on Iraq, and I want to hear what everyone else has to say. But I do. Also, I changed at the last minute what I was going to talk about. I was going to talk about Jawad Salim's Monument to Freedom and different conceptions of time, temporality in that monument. But if you're interested, you can read the epilogue of my book. So I'm going to actually talk about something I got a little riled up about last night reading the media. Thinking about kind of what the discourse is in the U.S. media right now about the invasion of Iraq 16 years ago. And, as Jenna just said, the way it's framed is that it was a giant mistake, right? Not that it was wrong to begin with, but that it was a mistake. Things went wrong sort of strategically. And I don't know if anyone's been following this, but there was a recent memo that was released or discovered or something by William Burns, who was the Assistant Secretary of State under Bush. And the memo is called A Perfect Storm. And so basically, first of all, there's the media discourse on this memo, and then there's the memo itself, which I just read this morning or skimmed. The sort of discourse on it is, there was this prophetic guy, William Burns, who actually predicted everything that was going to happen, and nobody listened to him, right? So it's a familiar story in a way, right? That, I'll say how I think it's familiar. The discourse on this document, on this memo, is that Burns predicted sort of the chaos that would happen in Iraq as a result of the invasion, that Iraq would evolve into sectarian chaos, right? So this is the narrative that basically what Saddam Hussein was doing was repressing, the inherent sort of sectarian violence and other kinds of violence in Iraq, and if you unleash that, then all hell will break loose. If you actually read the memo, it's not exactly what it says. I mean, what the memo says, actually, first of all, it's not a warning that we shouldn't do this. It actually says this could be a historic turning point in the Middle East and U.S. interests. He thinks actually that it could work out perfectly fine. But his job here in the memo is to say everything that he thinks could possibly go wrong, right? It's a strategic document. He says, I do believe if we do it right, this could be a tremendous boon to the future of the region and U.S. national security interests and so on. That's the first point. The second point is, the document is really, really specific about specific things that he thinks could go wrong. If the Kurds do this, Turkey might do this, and then Syria might do this, and then the Shia might do that. It's a series of bullet points about all possible things. If the Palestinians rebel against the invasion, then Israel will do this, and that could lead to that. There's many, many different things in the memo, actually, and most of which did not happen, right? So what the media has focused on in their summary of this report is what the report says is Iraq, again, is just in this inherent state of sectarianism, right? And you have to be careful because that will explode if you invade. But the memo never actually says that. I'm partly interested in this. I think it's relevant to the themes of the conference because partly how I'm interpreting the title of the conference, Beyond Conflict and Turmoil. I'm assuming that sort of the idea behind that was not that Iraq is beyond conflict and turmoil, and it's not that we here are going to push Iraq beyond conflict and turmoil. It's partly, at least partly, that how can we get beyond narrating Iraq as this constant space of turmoil and conflict, right? That Iraq is almost synonymous with conflict and turmoil. What other ways can we think about Iraq? These narratives have a long history. The reception of this memo, I think, is really consistent with sort of American representations of Iraq for a long time as a space, and European also, as a space of violence. And also this sort of trope of the recovery or discovery or release of historical documents that prove this inherent sectarianism of Iraq. I mean, I wrote an article for Jadalia like a few years ago on the making of Iraq's borders and on I was basically criticizing this artificial state narrative, right? That Iraq is basically, from the beginning, was this impossible collection of sectarian and ethnic groups that the British artificially cobbled together and drew borders around. That narrative has huge historical flaws, actually, in terms of, if you actually look at how Iraq's borders were created. They were created like all nation-state borders have been created, through a long, drawn-out process of conflict and war and negotiation, right? It took all the way through the 20s, and actually even still in the 80s, they're fighting, or 90s, for example, they're still fighting over the borders. So there's nothing actually very unusual about how Iraq's borders were created. But I was more interested in that article about this artificial state narrative and the times in which it becomes prominent and the times in which it dies down. It was originally, I argue in that article, it was originally a British colonial narrative. The argument was that Iraq is too fragmented to govern itself, and therefore it must be governed by Britain. That was where the artificial state narrative comes from. It was a British colonial discourse. You don't find it in the writing of Iraqi nationalists, even Iraqi Arab nationalists in the 1920s. Even the Arab nationalists wanted to create Iraq as a bordered state, as the first stage, towards a later Arab political union. Iraqi nationalists, considered Iraq to be a more genuine and historical entity. But either way, you don't find this artificiality narrative in Iraqi discourse 20s, 30s, 40s. You also, it goes away in the West for a while, right? It's a really prominent British narrative during the Mandate. But if you look at even American discourse in the 80s, you don't find people going on and on about how Iraq is an artificial state. I think it really comes into play after the U.S. invasion of '91, and then especially 2003. And I think it has a lot to do with the wars, basically my argument is, what harm had been done in destroying a country that never authentically existed in the first place. That's where I think that narrative is really coming from. We didn't destroy a country, that wasn't a real country anyways, right? And it was bound for destruction and for falling apart. So I'm seeing the response to this memo in a similar way. And another thing I would like to connect it to is the way in which violence gets narrated in Iraq during a Western occupation, after Western occupation. This is similar to how Iraqi violence was portrayed after the British invasion of Iraq during World War I, and then during the British military occupation of Iraq. In fact, I think the artificial state narrative is partly a way to avoid talking about the actual violence of the actual British occupation, right? You focus on the Sykes-Picot map, and it sounds like the British are sitting in these, sitting in their living rooms over tea in Britain and drawing these lines on a map. It's actually, the map was a map of an actually existing occupation, right? So why focus on the map rather than on the occupation? The map was just illustrating an existing occupation. So I'm just going to read you one little quote from my book. This is not my quote. This is from A.T. Wilson, who was a British official in Iraq during the Iraqi rebellion, the Iraqi anti-colonial revolt or revolution. It's called both things, of 1920. And he writes his memoir, and he's talking about what he calls the, quote, measures of punishment as well as of pacification that British troops carried out in response to this anti-colonial rebellion, which stretched over large parts of Iraq. So he writes, quote, tragedy, it's very philosophical, tragedy, according to Aristotle, purges the emotions through pity combined with fear. It excites emotion only to allay it, and in the calm which follows the storm, the cure of emotional disorder is found. Milton regards it as a means of homeopathic treatment, a catharsis, curing emotion by means of an emotion like in kind, but not identical. I know it's a weird quote, you might be wondering why I'm reading it, but I'll explain it to you. What he's saying here is, he's trying to explain the British violence, the violence of the British repression of the revolt, right, which included mass bombings by airplanes, leveling entire villages whose residents were assumed to have participated in the revolt, burning down entire villages, whipping, hanging, other forms of torture, mass exile, and so on. He doesn't actually say any of this. What he says, but he's referring euphemistically to it by saying what we were doing was curing Iraq's emotional disorder. So the violence comes from Iraqis, it doesn't come from us, right? We're curing Iraq's emotional disorder by means of an emotion like in kind, right? So our violence is just a reflection of the violence of Iraqis, right? Our violence is not our violence. So I think that is really similar to sort of how this report, this memo has been received, that the disaster, the catastrophe of the illegal U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 can be explained by the violence of Iraqis, right? That's how you explain the devastation that has occurred since 2003. So I'm going to stop there, and we'll move on to Zahra.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So again, thank you very much, Jannah, and everyone for organizing such a great event. So I'm really, really glad to be on a panel with such amazing scholars, colleagues, friends, and
musicians.
Yeah, fellow musicians, singers as well. And I really appreciate as well the format of the conference, the fact that it gathers many scholars and artists from different background and perspective, and that also it leaves enough time for discussion,
Yes.
and that we really, really need. So the topic is so enormous. Like I was rereading the paragraph that you sent us, and I was like, oh God, I have to speak about post 2003 Iraq in 10 minutes. What am I going to say? So what I'm going to do is just evoke a few points, 6 points, 5-6 points, and perhaps maybe reflect with you, especially because I'm just back from Iraq. I spent most of this month in Baghdad and a little bit in the south of Iraq. So I just want to share with you, a few fresh observations and reflections on not only the post-2003 Iraq, but also on ways to, analyze it, study it, approach it, right? So first, I'll comment on the title of our panel. So yes, it is the 16th tragic anniversary of the criminal, whatever word we use, invasion of Iraq. And as much as it is important to talk about what happened since 2003, it is also very important to avoid falling into short-term historical analysis of Iraq. If the invasion and occupation of 2003 represents a shift, definitely, imperialist intervention started way before that, and it's really impossible to understand what happened since 2003 if we don't look at the very deep, very violent impact of the sanctions on Iraq's social fabric. So 2003 just carried on a process of state destruction, economic, social, and political crisis that really redefined social relations. So in my work on women and gender, on family dynamics, I show how the sanctions altered really social values, family dynamics, pushing the emergence of new forms of patriarchy in context of exacerbated poverty. So that's my first point. My second point would be that when we talk about post-2003 Iraq, there are many words that we tend to use, myself as well, I'm including myself in the critique. Words such as militarization and retribalization. I'll talk a little bit more about the word sectarianism later. And so, when we think about these phenomenon, I think we really need to go back to actually the formation of the modern state during the colonial period. It is really important when it comes to women and gender issues. In my book, I show how not only notions of masculinities and femininities are shaped by post-colonial state formations and competing ideas of nationhood, that would define who is the other, but also how notions of rights are defined, redefined by these dynamics. So it's true that in many ways, and I think I agree very much with you, Sarah, the political and social dynamics provoked by the invasion and occupation are definitely comparable to the ones of the British colonization of Iraq. putting in power a conservative elite that is more concerned about serving its own communal, urban, economic and political privileges than to foster any kind of genuine equitable societal development. The British really tribalized women in creating regimes of rights based on the urban versus rural opposition and communal identities. And since 2003, I wrote so much about that. The invasion and occupation sectarianized women's rights, questioning very essential achievements. So, after all, the Iraqi personal status code, although still very patriarchal when it was established in 1959, was still the produce of negotiations between different social and political forces of the time, in which feminist activists were involved, right? So the fact that it relies on both Sunni and Shia jurisprudence, and that it developed a quite advanced, I mean, at the time, in the 60s, the personal status code was the most progressive in the region, right? And it became even more progressive in the 70s when it was reformed. So these achievements, although limited, are definitely in danger when we think about, for example, the Ja'fari law, and more generally of the structural, social, economic, and political framing, right, of gender norms and relations today. The everyday structural forms of violence and inequalities that define gender norms and relations. So to foster equality or gender inclusivity, I mean, you need definitely a strong health and education system. You need childcare. You need a functioning society. You need as much social and sectarian equality, right? So my third point would be that we really need to go beyond also the sectarian analysis, right? The analysis focused on defining everything's going on in Iraq, through sectarianism. So I reflect critically on my previous work in saying that, or perhaps my more recent fieldwork convinced me that ethno-sectarianism is no longer the major driver of conflict, especially if we look at the political economy of armed violence, and the process that I call militiazation, the militiazation of social and political life in Iraq. So in Iraq today, yes, we do have the great right to vote. Wow, we're such a democracy, right? Mm-hmm. But if we express any kind of critique of the so-called war on terror, or of certain armed groups or militia, if we critique certain political figures, we'd better leave the country. Otherwise, we'll get killed in broad daylight, just like it happened to so many activists, scholars, media figures just recently. So the so-called democratic elections, called by many political analysts, including many respected scholars, right? It was called like a peaceful power transition. And it's nothing else in reality than the institutionalization of this militiazation, of the post-2003 regime. So the ways in which the horrible and unspeakable violence experienced by the population of Al-Mosul and the north of the country, and we're going to hear more about it with Omar Mohammed later today. I mean, this, unspeakable violence experienced by the population and the ISIS during, the war against ISIS is not dealt at all by the political elite. It is, on the contrary, instrumentalized by various political agendas that are far from concerned with peace and equality. I mean, when we think about how sexual violence has been instrumentalized, it's I think, very relevant to our conversation. So it's been now almost 10 years that I started doing in-depth and extensive field work within women and civil society political groups in Iraq. Mainly Baghdad. I've done work in Kurdistan as well, in the cities of Erbil and Sulaymaniyah, and more recently, I think since 2016, I started to work in the south of the country. And I have really witnessed how political violence define what activists can say, how they can concretely organize, where they can or cannot circulate. And so women's rights groups are really caught between, on the one hand, what I call the NGOization or NGOization of their activism, and also the necessity to articulate political agendas and forms of activism that negotiate with the very destruction of the state and its institutions. women's groups, I mean, since 2003, really like a few weeks after the invasion, have been really acting as substitutes of state institution, of the lack of state institution, trying to support society in a context of lack of essential services. So, and on the other hand, you know, women's rights activists have been dealing with tribalization and armed violence. And interestingly, I can say that, and that's my following point, the most non-formally politically organized or spontaneous kind of mobilization really pushed many women and civil society groups to kind of radicalize, and when I say radicalize is the positive use of the word radicalize, to really radicalize their agendas, you know, beyond NGOization, beyond, you know, implementation of certain, you know, UN whatever agendas. And, you know, if we think about it, since 2011, all the major movement of protest started after that. A young man was killed by security forces when demonstrating in Basra. It was the case in 2011, it was the case in 2015, and it was the case last summer. The same exact thing, and then after demonstrations, you know, are organized in Baghdad and all over the country, right? So I think that these movements of protest really illustrate how much, instead of superficial analysis involving, for example, I mean, so many things have been written on Islamist, like the Islamist versus secular, I mean the Islamist versus secular thing, sectarianism again. So I think we really need to look at the structural dimensions of conflict, the everyday life dimensions. And I think that in regards to this, I've learned a lot with, you know, by the notion that you developed, Omar, the notion of toxicity of everyday survival. I think it's you know, a notion that is essential and that I'm, you know, really integrating more and more in my thinking and analysis. So, and finally, I want to conclude with something perhaps controversial, but something that really obsesses me so much, like, which is, you know, it's more like a broader kind of debate, maybe involving more scholars, but I think it involves everyone, which is, you know, knowledge production, right? How we produce knowledge on Iraq, about Iraq. And many of us, I think, are involved in conversations around the necessity to decolonize knowledge. I think it's very trendy to use the word decolonization. You decolonize academia, decolonize this and that, which is great, which is really great. But I think there's a lot written, there's a lot of philosophical thinking about the topic, but I think that there are very few concrete things, right? And I think what brought me, for example, to start, you know, researching, to, you know, go back, like in Iraq, conduct really extensive field work, is the fact that so much of what is written on Iraq is written as if Iraq is really a thing, right? In the mind of many scholars. Of course, the white men political scientists, I mean, of course, but not only. The scholarship written by Iraqi intellectuals from the diaspora is often very much disconnected from the realities and the social and political dynamics existing inside the country. And I think we really need to question the way knowledge is produced on Iraq. The very fact that most scholars do not even care about translating their work in Arabic, right? And making it accessible to Iraqis themselves. The total lack of engagement, total absence of care for Iraqi academia and academics. And, you know, the lack of reflection on the power relations existing, you know, between scholars here and there. Who is the audience when we produce this knowledge? What impact does it have in Iraq? Who are we quoting? Who exists in what we write? Who does not exist in our work? What are, I'm going to be like Bourdieusian, what are les conditions sociales et politiques de possibilité, the social and political condition of possibilities of knowledge on Iraq? So of course it's a very complex subject, and I know that, you know, language is only one dimension of the problem, and I think that it's very urgent that we all collectively reflect on that, acknowledge our limits, and push ourselves toward a more equitable or inclusive way of doing the work we do. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think I'm just going to relegate to Zahra's arguments. I really want to pick up from where Zahra has left, and try to really also push ourselves a bit more with this with thinking in this conference. And I really am very, very excited and very glad and grateful for the graduate students here to really be trying to push the envelope on the question of Iraq, and trying to go a little bit beyond the narratives of loss or the narratives of destruction and the impossibility of knowing Iraq. I think kind of what Sarah has said and what Zahra is also kind of alluding to is this kind of common discourse about Iraq as an impossible place to kind of think about or write about or research and all of that, because so many different reasons. And what I want to do today, I mean, in this very short period of time, is actually propose exactly the opposite of that. Is to say that that in a way, what I feel post-2003 is a form of liberation. Liberation, not the word liberation that George Bush and the cronies in the White House talked about, but a liberation for us from the shackles of the political, media, and academic discourses that has shaped Iraq for a really long time. And I will try to make this argument a little bit clearer with 3 examples from the work that I'm doing, but also a kind of what I want to do is a bit of a storytelling mode, being a storytelling, to just tell you how what I propose is that to look at Iraq as also not only as a place to research, but as also a method, as a way to understand what happens when all the frameworks and the paradigms of understanding Iraq collapse in front of us, and every time we're trying to fit Iraq in a model, it doesn't work. So how does that allows us to reorient our thinking and methodological thinking specifically to try to actually start anew, start in a way, to kind of let go of a lot of our baggage, the theory and the kind of the common discourses, and start from our own perceptions, observations, and intuitions. So my 3 stories have to do a lot with my own life. I mean, it has to do a lot with how I myself grew up in Iraq as in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And as Jenna told you, I'm a physician originally. I was trained in Iraq as a doctor. I worked in the 90s as a physician during one of the worst period, I think, of destruction. And I'm here kind of re-emphasize what Zahra was saying around the issue of the sanctions, because that became a completely forgotten moment in the shift between the kind of the Saddam regime and the kind of post-Saddam regime. So the sanctions really is somewhat of a mystery in many ways. What happened during that period that things kind of look the way they look right now. So when I started my PhD, I mean, I left Iraq in '98, so 21 years ago. And I was like, as a physician, I had to flee because I wasn't allowed to leave the country at that time. So like many of my colleagues, the doctors, who kind of escaped and trying to look for a better life somewhere else. And I kind of ended up shifting my career in many ways. I moved to study anthropology, ended up getting a kind of a scholarship to go to come to the U.S. to do a PhD in anthropology. And of course, as soon as I entered in August 2001, 1 month later, 9/11 happened. And as someone had an Iraqi passport, I got stuck in a lot of the dynamics that happened back then. But also the war, the preparation for the war presented a very much of a shift for me, because I wasn't really planning to study Iraq. But the war almost brought Iraq back to my life in many ways, because also studying a place you just escaped from was a bit too much for you didn't want to engage with it all the time and wanted to do something else. But the war kind of brought Iraq back into my lap, and I had to kind of confront the post 2003 occupation, but also to confront all the discourses about Iraq in the United States and in the West, and knowing that Iraq for the longest period of time was completely disconnected from more empirical research. So a lot of people who have studied Iraq have kind of mostly benefited from a kind of the textual turn in theory and in social sciences and the humanities, and mostly kind of worked on looking at notions of discourse and what Saddam has said and what Saddam hasn't said, and what the Ba'ath Party is doing, what kind of production of textuality about Iraq that we can always try to use to look at kind of what Iraq is in many ways. So I think after 2003, what happened is that these kind of frameworks were all destroyed as much as the kind of the infrastructure in Iraq was destroyed. And in a way, what I mean by liberation in that kind of sense is that it pushes you to try to rethink these projects that you have to do. You have to think about Iraq. If you want to do a study on Iraq, you have to really rethink what does it mean to do archives? What does it mean to look at secondary sources? What does it mean to look at primary sources? What does it mean to do interviews? What does it mean to speak about Iraq when you are not necessarily in Iraq? And these are questions were very, very pertinent for the project that I was trying to look at, which is really bring back a history of Iraq that has to do a lot with institution buildings, with the medical establishment, with how statecraft was actually in a place like Iraq was tied very much to this infrastructural history. And it's not that infrastructure is not just about Iraq. It's not really bounded by Iraqi borders. It is something so much bigger. So in a way, Iraq was already transnational from the beginning, from the formation of the state was already a transnational project. And the kind of the story of the escape of the doctors to England and how they incorporated themselves in the National Health Service in Britain, where the whole the collapse of the NHS was kind of prevented by Iraqi doctors and other doctors from the post-colony in Britain, where they held that system together. So I was really interested in looking at that kind of historical moment. But however, one of the things that one of the kind of a methodological, I think, intervention that I'd like to think about it as something that I've contributed to is taking this discourse around ungovernability of Iraq and really use it against itself, kind of inverting it in a way and saying, well, let me take ungovernability seriously. Let's look, yeah, I mean, what is ungovernable here? Why is this every time there is these crises, this discourse about ungovernability emerges? Why? And it doesn't look like it's just about the post-2003. It has to do, as you kind of said, partly from that kind of colonial history. And my interest as a doctor also, it kind of maybe helped me to escape some of the shackles of textuality. I was seeing Iraq being blown up into pieces, and these pieces were material pieces, were also flesh, and were also bones and lives and all of that. So I had to kind of rethink a lot of these projects in relationship to these problems that the war brought in. And in a way, it got me out of some of the limits of thinking about Iraq in that setting. So this is the first story. The second kind of story is when I returned back from finishing my dissertation, and I got my first job in Beirut. And in Beirut, first thing I started noticing there is that there's a lot of Iraqis in the streets, and some of them were maybe tourists, some of them were, and it turned out that a lot of them, majority, were patients trying to seek care in Beirut hospitals for cancer, for wound injuries, for all kinds of operations. And these were not necessarily your classical medical tourists. They were people who had lost faith in the Iraqi healthcare system, something that they actually have always respected and accepted as something that is important in their lives, and they wanted quality healthcare. And they had to kind of sell things, and they had to negotiate that these kind of everyday problems with their bodies that being blown up into pieces, and cancer that is emerging in everywhere, and the infections that are ravaging the country, and trying to really define a new trajectory of therapy, of care, how these modes of care are emerging in this point was something that I really was very interested in relationship to the not only the kind of discursive changes around Iraq, but around ecological changes in Iraq. Like really, these are material, toxic outcomes of the war. How do people inhabit these environments. So I started really thinking about the idea of the wound. Iraq also as a wound, for us, many of us, a collective wound. A collective wound that also translate with that has this interplay, this multiple registers on the body, in history, in the memory, and in everyday relations. This kind of tensions that are also emerge in everyday life through people wounding each other in many ways. So that was also a very productive moment that I was like, okay, let me try to see this. There's no other place that could tell you a better story about wounds than a place like Iraq. And what really was fascinating about the project, the more I, the pun is intended, the more I probed the wound, the more the wound opened up and was telling kind of these incredible environmental stories, medical stories, social stories, political stories, stories about the temporalities of war in Iraq. Some of the wounds were fresh from the ISIS or from the U.S. Snipers and the bombings, and some of them were actually from the Iran-Iraq war. Sometimes in the same family you have someone who was injured in the present day, and then some people who've been kind of injured in previous wars. So the wound was kind of telling something, telling a history about of Iraq, of Iraqis and their bodies and their futures and their kind of the way they've struggled. So what was really fascinating in post-2003, there was an infection that the U.S. military started kind of talking about, which is a bacterial infection, an multi-drug resistant bacteria that began to appear in the wounds of a lot of the U.S. military servicemen who are injured in Iraq. And these infections, these bacteria that were kind of being carried all the way back to the United States and infecting a lot of civilians here, and then in the military, that bacteria was called the Iraqi Doctor to refer to the war, Iraqi Doctor. So I was very fascinated by this Iraqi Doctor story. I mean, so how can we really, what do we know about it, and why is it Iraqi? What is Iraqi about Iraqi Doctor, and how Iraqi is Iraqi Doctor? So the question for me was kind of, we started looking, collecting. A lot of people became interested in this project, and the more we started studying and looking at the conditions of possibility of research, we started understanding that that bacteria actually holds in the genetic codes of it some of the histories of war. That actually, if we can sequence some of this bacteria, we can actually get an archive of how this bacteria transformed over time, and actually and if we put the kind of the right historical narrative or the right historical timeline against these genetic makeup, it was something that this genetic archive could tell us something. So we discovered something more like 2,000 specimens of this bacteria in the AUB medical freezers. That you can actually send or sequence some of these things and try to actually get some understanding of how war defines the emergence of this multi-drug resistant bacteria. So that project was very, very useful, and what really made me think about is that Iraq's archive, the one that we kind of keep on fighting about and saying, oh, we can't use it, or we can use it, or it's destroyed, or it's not destroyed. It's something emergent. It's something constantly emerging right now, and we need to kind of look at archive as a form of life, because this history is constantly changing, and these kind of, and we can see them in this material legacies of the war. And the last kind of thing that I want to have, like just 1 minute, maybe I'll go 1 minute over. But the other thing, I mean, I apologize that we missed yesterday's presentation. But actually, we were performing Iraqi Maqam in Lincoln Center. And this is a story that I wanted to also share with you, because one of the fascinating things that happened after 2003 is that some of the recordings from Iraq that were kind of, a lot of people were recording parties and gigs and all of that, actually all got smuggled out of Iraq and got digitized in Chicago by an Iraqi sound engineer who was there, and he actually had cancer and died as he finished the archives. So this archive became, when I was here studying and I started learning, working on the tradition with my colleague Amir al-Safar, this archive was the material that we used to learn the maqam. I mean, Amir studied with Hamid al-Sa'di, and now we have Hamid al-Sa'di here. But the experience of trying to understand what this tradition is was possible because of these recordings in many ways, and I feel like there's really now a kind of a genuine interest in thinking about that. I see Farah sitting over there, who is doing an ethnomusicology thesis on the Iraqi maqam, and she's been spending a lot of time listening, recording, writing notes, trying to learn something, and this is kind of the way to do it. This is the way to think about it, is to immerse yourself in this material and get something out of it. So in conclusion, I'd like to kind of just reiterate this kind of provocative kind of thing that I said in the beginning, that I see that at least maybe after all this injury that I've experienced in my own life and the wounds of Iraq with me, I feel like now a bit more on the liberated side. No thanks to George Bush, but in a way it is something that I try not to anymore to think about the kind of a loss that we had, but actually a kind of our own liberations from the kind of the problems of, is it Arab nationalism or Iraqi nationalism? Is it blah 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 or blah blah? No, let's try to let go of this and try to begin anew, trying to understand things as they are in a way that allows us to maybe produce something about Iraq that was not necessarily possible, even if the war didn't happen. So I think it's a kind of a very generative moment right now, and we need to embrace it. Thank you very much.
Next is Sinan. Right, is that right? Oh, no, is it the second one? Wait, where are we?
Well, I mean, I could go if you whatever you.
Actually, it's the Omar Sirri. Sorry. Yeah. See you later. His name.
That's right.
Right in the middle.
Sorry. That's here. Should I unplug it then? This is for me, right? How's this, Jim? It's okay? Yeah. Great. First off, thank you to Jen, Afnan, and Jim for inviting me to join you all today. I'm honored to be part of this event with such amazing people. At the end of April 2018, I stood at a checkpoint in the Karada district of Baghdad, observing the everyday practices of security personnel as they monitored a landscape pockmarked by checkpoints and road barriers. What are these security installations and procedures all for? I asked a police officer I had befriended during my research. It's just routine, he replied. But what's it all good for? I pushed him. He patiently and briefly responded. There isn't much impact. Those with money and power aren't affected by checkpoints. It's only the poor who are stopped by them, who are hurt by them. This police officer, burdened with the impossible responsibility of countering the threats that have plagued Baghdad for most of the century, succinctly pointed to the political economic conditions that produce and are produced by security practices and infrastructure. So I want to ask today, what is the relationship between security, space, and political economic conditions in contemporary Baghdad? Over the past year and continuing through today, spatial transformations in Baghdad's security infrastructure have altered the city's streetscapes. These spatial transformations are grounded in the narrative that Baghdad's physical threats and insecurities are yesterday's reality. and that the beleaguered city is witnessing resurgent socio-spatial stability. This narrative is not new. We have heard such prognosticating at different intervals since 2003. It remains as unconvincing now as it has before. The spectre of violence is as ubiquitous as ever. More dangerous still, the evocation of a return to stability belies how it is instability that motivates and feeds the political economic conditions of the city and the country. I'm going to trace these transformations and the narratives that surround them, and then briefly reflect on what they mean for Baghdad and Iraq, present and future. Let's first turn to the transformation of Baghdad's security spaces. On the screen are photos of a checkpoint at the entrance of Inner Qarada Street. Or rather, these photos are of this checkpoint's removal. The checkpoint was dismantled this past February, less than 2 months ago, at the order of Baghdad Operations Command, BOC, the institution responsible for managing the city's security apparatuses. The photos are from the BOC's Facebook page, which promotes the institution's initiatives and ostensible successes. These few photos from early 2018, just over a year ago, are from Mansour district in West Baghdad, on the other side of the city from Qarada. They are banal and mundane. But they do reveal the removal, or partial removal, of concrete barriers that once blocked these streets from vehicle traffic. Around the same time, about a year ago, Mansour also witnessed the removal of some neighborhood checkpoints. Here you won't see a checkpoint, obviously, and this is where a checkpoint once stood, where you see the white and red wall there. To the left on this photo is where a neighborhood checkpoint Mansour once stood. Such security transformations have continued unabated for most of the last year. The spatial transformations around security infrastructure in Baghdad are ongoing. Some of these checkpoints and barriers have been in place since just after the 2003 invasion. But they were installed in far greater numbers in 2007, when the US military laid out its Baghdad security plan and launched Operation Enforcing the Law, also known as the surge of US troops. These extended closures have shaped not just movement in the city, but the very possibility of imagining it. Such Baghdadi residents have forgotten where some roads and routes lead. Their city has been interrupted at various intersections, and they are cut off from its past. The US military's recently published 2-volume history of its occupation and stationing in Iraq from 2003 to 2011 states that US forces laid more than 30 miles of concrete barriers known as T-walls. Coincidentally, US troops actually coined state names for the different sizes of these walls. So New Jersey for shorter walls, and Virginia and Texas for larger walls. Iraqi forces were partners in this infrastructure during its construction, and it was Iraqi security institutions that inherited the infrastructure after the US's, now we know, temporary withdrawal in 2011. The walls and checkpoints shaped what Zoltan Gluck, writing about Nairobi, calls an entrenched, quote, security urbanism. In this landscape, a city's infrastructure and micro-practices are key to structuring a, quote, counter-terror state effect. It is ultimately political conditions that produce so-called security improvements. The removal of checkpoints and barriers began in earnest after Iraq's former Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi declared victory over Daesh in December 2017. The removals continued into 2018 in the lead-up to parliamentary elections last May. Unfortunately for Abadi, turnout was the lowest Iraq has experienced since the US-led invasion. The official election turnout was about 44%. Independent observers tell me the number was far lower. In Abadi's home district of Qarada, turnout was abysmal at 15%, with some polling stations in the district reporting still lower. Chole, as one soldier reported, it was like a desert out there. The general Baghdadi public is deeply skeptical of the utility of these checkpoints and street barriers. In the eyes of one of my interlocutors, a former Iraqi private security contractor, checkpoints are scarecrows in the streets. They are there to show the state and project fear in would-be militants, but ultimately do not offer any serious improvement to security. In January 2018, just as the city's omnipresent barriers and checkpoints were beginning to disappear in West Baghdad's Mansour district, a double suicide attack hit Bayaran Square, a major transportation hub in the heart of the city and just east of the Tigris River. The attack killed 35 people, mostly day laborers, mulling the square early in search of work from passers-by. So is insecurity yesterday's reality? Last summer, the Washington Post ran a flashy piece on how Baghdad had, quote, gotten its groove back. New restaurants were springing up, the city's youth were out enjoying a buzzing cafe culture, bars serving high-priced booze were reopening in five-star hotels. At best, these flimsy indicators are a study in cultural legibility among particularly Western readers. They could not be farther from the realities and challenges of life in Baghdad. Baghdad's returning groove is hauntingly similar to journalistic and policy narratives about Baghdad in 2008. At that time, we were told the surge had uprooted marauding militias from the city's streets. This triumphant story, as Zahra Ali has shown, masks the biopolitical nature of U.S. counterinsurgency strategy. Indeed, counterinsurgency tactics ultimately facilitated further ethnic cleansing of some of Baghdad's diverse neighborhoods. In a similar way, today's narrative of a return to stability relies on masking structures of power and violence under the veneer of groove. We find these masks at various points in the U.S. military's recently published history about its time in Iraq, a roughly 1,400-page document chock-filled with imperial, or perhaps imperially empirical tidbits. Under the subheading, Returning to Normality, scholars celebrate economic improvements such as the reopening of markets and an annual economic growth rate of 9% in 2008 in Baghdad. U.S. forces even worked to reopen Baghdad's public swimming pools to provide, quote, idle young men something to do. It was called Operation Speedo. That's not from The Onion. This ostensible normality was short-lived. We all know what the last decade in Iraq has wrought, most notably the rise of Daesh and its vicious consolidation of one-third of Iraq's territory. There were great fears Baghdad would fall for a second time this century, this time not to U.S. forces but to radical militants. While this worst-case scenario did not materialize, the people of Baghdad were not spared trauma. On the 3rd of July 2016, a truck packed with explosives entered the heart of Inner Karada Street and exploded. The official death toll of 324 did not account for the tens of people who, one local politician told me, burned to death from the ensuing fire. Their remains as ash were never recovered or counted. Narratives of normality from 2008 or funky grooves from a decade later in 2018 fail to capture this ongoing trauma and suffering. It also comfortably overlooks the rising discontent among ordinary Iraqis. This discontent is certainly not new. We saw thousands take to the streets in 2011 and 2012 in Baghdad and throughout the country, demanding an end to corruption and basic economic justice. We saw this again in 2015 and 2016, and still again just last summer, most notably in Basra. So before and during and after Daesh. I want to suggest then that we need to better understand the forces undergirding what Reynad Mansour calls Iraq's, quote, cycles of collapse that have shaped state-building efforts since 2003. Attending to these cycles challenges the tired boundaries between normality and exceptional violence, between the groovy and the grotesque. A return to political economic conditions is crucial to dismantling these binaries. In the aftermath of 2003, there was a scramble to secure capital in a variety of ways. The microscopic version of this scramble was the infamous looting that U.S. forces permitted, aided, and abetted in the early days of the occupation. And I do not simply mean here what Donald Rumsfeld, with his rather noxious mix of ignorance and hubris, called the many vases being stolen, but also the public property and heritage that now line the coffers of militants, smugglers, and collectors. Far less discussed and much less researched is Baghdad's subjection to regimes of land accumulation, appropriation, and privatization in the last decade and a half. These processes of land transfer have come in multiple forms. Baghdad's new and glitzy shopping malls, particularly in upper-class Mansour district, are one such form. There is certainly a lot to think about here in terms of the growing hegemony of corporations and brands and capital, and their resonance among Baghdad's economic elite. But I'm more interested in the land that these consumer spaces occupy. Mansour Mall opened its doors in the summer of 2013. Located at the end of a bustling consumer avenue, part of it stands on the former grounds of the Mansour Central Market. This older shopping mall, effectively, was state-run and offered residents affordable and in most cases subsidized high-quality foreign goods. The Mansour Market was one of 8 central markets built, owned, and run by Iraqi state authorities in the 1980s. and which, by the way, is kind of further, to follow up on this term, notion is further a reminder of the need to reach back before 2003 in our research on Iraq. Otherwise, we further peddle in narratives of masks across time. In 2011, and this photo, I should just note, is the, as it says here, is the first day of the destruction of the former Mansour Central Market, for part of it at least, to make way for Mansour Mall. In 2011, the National Investment Commission officially announced, quote, investment opportunities in Baghdad's central markets. It was hardly a coincidence that the privatization effort happened the same year U.S. troops exited Iraq. U.S. forces had, after all, occupied 2 of these former markets, using them as forward operating bases. We often hear about the destruction of the Iraqi state after 2003. But what has this destruction looked like? How do we understand it as destroying and reshaping the very surface of the city? Who benefited from the new Mansour Mall? For many Baghdadis, it's enough to know that the culprits are a kleptocratic political elite. As one woman put it in late 2017 when asked about the sell-off of the long-defunct central markets, quote, they want to take it for themselves. Halalhum. The Iraqi people haven't benefited one bit. How have we benefited? Not a bureaucrat, not a student, nor anyone else. Nobody has benefited. Neither the old nor the young. It all goes into the pockets of the government. Here, government, I think, is key. In the case of Mansour Mall, at least, the owner is a close affiliate. It's reported to be a close affiliate of the Islamic Da'wah Party, the political home of 2 of Iraq's former prime ministers, Nouri al-Maliki and Hadi al-Abadi, since 2006. Thus, one force that has persisted through these cycles are the ravenous and enriched political and economic forces who deploy security and stability to occlude how private and state actors rely on constant instability and urban precarity. My invitation here, I'll finish here, is to explore how these checkpoints, walls, and barriers, in both their presence and absence, have hidden and sought to remove from public debate the city's political economic transformations. These transformations shape and sustain another infrastructure, an infrastructure of amnesia that circumscribes political imagination. This infrastructure entails the literal forgetting of past lives, whether on the roads and streets of comfort, familiarity, and social life, or the history of the city's state-led market interventions. The infrastructure of amnesia is also a form of politics. By rejecting the past, it seeks at every turn to contain and limit alternative political futures. If U.S. political and military forces initiated such a project, a coterie of Iraqi elite embraced it with open arms and open wallets. What is at stake, then, is the future of the city and the everyday lives of those who reside in it. Iraqis have fought the corruption that is the lifeblood of Baghdad's violence. The results have been mixed. But this political work means we do not have the luxury of bearing the prospect of political possibility just yet. While the odds are stacked against them, from the global plane of transnational capital to the molecular scale on which NGOization seeks to stifle political creativity, we know that these organizers and activists threaten the political economic elite. The responses of these elites are intimately linked to spectacular violence, a structural political condition in which the security checkpoint is a scarecrow playing a big part in a ruthless theater of operations. As the scarecrow appears to be coming off the stage, there will no doubt be a hungry search for an alternate that can both hide and underpin those interests, which depend on an environment of lethal and persistent insecurity and violence. Thank you very much.
So I think we go back to questions. Oh, sorry. Sinan is our next speaker.
Thank you. I echo my fellow panelists. Thanks to the organizers, Jim. I think it's really great. And this fits well, I think, with this great presentation, because what I partly want to talk about is amnesia and damage, and why this is really great, and because, as all of you know, that the anniversary passed a few weeks ago with total silence, and this is where the liberal and illiberal scribes of empire in this country are in agreement. And even when, of course, many of us try to send something to the usual outlets, and some of them just say very innocently, well, we're not interested any material about the anniversary. And I just want to echo also and say that because this amnesia is so destructive, is that this whole discourse about the mistake is so offensive, of course, but it reproduces this constant amnesia and American innocence, which has been going on for 500 years. Because many of us, Iraqis in the diaspora and others, marched and demonstrated and wrote, and it did not take a geopolitical genius. And actually, I mentioned this in an article I wrote about the petition that a lot of diaspora Iraqis wrote, which was called No to Dictatorship and No to War, in which we specifically said that, this war is going to completely destroy the country, but it will have disastrous consequences in the region. So, and the other thing I want to add is definitely that the way we narrate the history of Iraq is, of course, really crucial. But to my mind, of course, the sanctions are very important, but 2003 is Act 3 in a way. And Act 1 was the 1991 completely forgotten war, which, aside from where you stand ethically, is very important to then understand what happens to Iraq when in 1991 it is triumphantly bombed back to the pre-industrial age. That will only illuminate what the consequences after that. So I think, in a way, that the post in post-2003 is kind of like the post in post-colonialism. One has to always remind oneself of what it means and how, it has a genealogy. Otherwise, the history will be truncated, and no matter where you stand, you will fall into this trap of reproducing parts of that larger discourse. So what I have been interested by and large, because I left Iraq in 1991, and it was, of course, always instructive in a very painful way to first be in a shelter and be in the city that was being bombed back to the pre-industrial age, and then come to the free world and then see how that war, of course, was represented in the media and how it was. And that's why the concept of collateral damage, this very evil concept and category, has been very important for me in trying to always think beyond it and try to make visible what that category disappears into the black holes of history. And so 91, the sanctions, but after 2003 also the material damage, but also the discursive damage. In a way, the panelists, beginning with Sarah, have talked about that, and how certain ways of thinking and imagining Iraq become impossible. And what interests me, of course, is how pervasive that became inside Iraq. Meaning that this notion of Iraq as an artificial state, of course, this was perpetuated through the new media outlets and the new cultural sphere in Iraq in post-2003, which was, of course, dominated by all of these largely exiled parties that came back through their satellite channels and whatnot. And of course, for the longest time, this was celebrated as being, such a great, open, free space, but it's actually completely chaotic. But through years of perpetuating these, this basically variations of this narrative as a sectarian Iraq, of course, the discursive damage in terms of how many Iraqis, specifically Iraqi makers of culture and writers and journalists and novelists, internalized that narrative, and what kind of consequences it starts to have for what type of novels they start to write, of course, and how that is also plugged into a new cultural landscape in the Arab world, whereby publishing is governed by certain prizes, and these prizes are located in the Gulf monarchies, and then how that is plugged into the terrain of so-called world literature, which of course is hostage or overdetermined by certain politics as to how Iraq. I'm saying all of this to say that one of the things that concern me is, of course, what type of novels get translated partly. And of course, one can say, well, your novels are translated, yes, But I contend that I try not to fall into that trap. So on the one hand, what type of narratives in the Anglophone world are privileged, which I contend that by and large, not always, but predominantly are about this ungovernable, unknowable, grotesque Iraq where there is just irrational violence. Of course, it uses different genres. It's surreal, it's gothic and whatever, and it depends on the way one reads it, but that contributes by and large to perpetuating the official US discourse about this Iraq that is so chaotic that we had to leave it because it's unknowable. On the other hand, what you have is the genres or writings of veterans who come back from Iraq, which is what I call embedded poetry and embedded novels, because it really, and I wrote one article, sorry to say what I've written, but because I'm old, but in terms of, because to show you how grotesque it is in this country, in that, so a film that is hailed and celebrated as an anti-war film is actually a film that promotes war. I'm talking about The Hurt Locker.
Yeah.
The Hurt Locker was celebrated as an anti-war film, but if you decode its narrative, it actually dovetails with the narratives of the Pentagon and the State Department. And the same thing goes for very famous poet Brian Turner, from one of whose poems the film's title was taken, Hurt Locker. And this Brian Turner, I got his poetry and I read it, and in the Iraq in his poetry has US soldiers and then has insurgents. So to come to the other point which concerns me is the disappearance of Iraqi civilians and the equivalence that's made time and again between US soldiers and Iraqi civilians, which is unacceptable to my mind. So what I try to focus on in terms of translating or studying certain Iraqi poets who also escape these types of narratives about Iraq, as the other thing about internalizing, I mean, we talked about this yesterday with Omar, about internalizing this notion that somehow Iraq has this exceptional trans-historical violence. And it's amazing when people who live in this country tell you that, where we are living and we are all beneficiaries of extensive genocide and slavery. So anyway, so I don't have time to talk about the poet that I've studied a lot and I'm working on and translating is Sargon Bolus, because he's an Iraqi American poet, but whose poetry really manages to sustain a critical discourse that tries to take stock of the various forms of destruction of Iraqi lives, but also of the idea of Iraq, without falling into these. So he links the violence into the larger violence of colonial modernity that we all live in. I just want to, sorry, I have to mention this anecdote, but it's amazing about how actually US soldiers become victims. I happened to be at a festival in France 3 months ago, and one would think that after 16 years, maybe I have high expectations of our species, but after 16 years, I expect a little bit more reflexivity. But this, nice gentleman was talking about his experience in Iraq, where he was in a tank, and he was saying how,
How it was.
Yeah.
how that they were met with a hostile culture. And this is the thing that we in this country have to think about, and I rarely use the we to include all of you, but what is it that makes these types of statements normal? This notion of victimhood and this notion that Americans, when they go west or when they go abroad, somehow they're bringing good with them. Because aside and beyond Iraq, unless we begin to contend with this notion of American benevolence, certain things are going to keep reproducing themselves. The other issue which haunts me is to talk about the discursive and the damage, is the looting and the plunder, not only of relics but also of archives, since we're talking about the knowledge production.
Yeah.
And I have to mention it again because we have to talk about the politics of scholarship and the responsibility of participating in working on looted material.
Yeah.
I understand one would say, well, all archives are colonial, and yes, but this is happening now. And why is that also problematic? And I'm talking about the archives that were looted in 1991 by Kenan McKee, and then again in 2003, and by the US Army, and then now it's all in Hudson Institute at Stanford.
Yep.
Aside from the egregious and horrible thing in that these are, of course, narratives about the lives of Iraqis, but also how Iraqi scholars have no access whatsoever to these. But more importantly, what that does to the so-called field of Iraq studies is that this focus on Saddam and the Ba'ath. Not that we don't need to know more about Saddam and the Ba'ath. There's a reason why the first novel I ever wrote was about what it means to live under the Ba'ath. But it ends up producing a disproportionate amount of knowledge that ends up again reproducing this larger narrative about Iraq as this locus of horrible, unknowable violence. So I think we have to, so I would call this also embedded scholarship in a way. Maybe I'm expecting too much from our fellow scholars, but I think there is a responsibility when you do that kind of work. The issue of loss, I know, and I always mention this, line and poem by the great Iraqi poet called "Nostalgia, My Enemy," because Saad Youssef, who lived in exile from the late 70s, kind of realizes that nostalgia can be detrimental to one's creativity and even one's scholarship. But I think when it comes to loss, it's very important for us to take stock of the loss that has occurred in Iraq, because as Omar was saying, and I'm interested very much in this, how to mourn the past in a very productive way, because unless one engages with the past, really the future will reproduce itself. And this, there are examples of this, whether here in this country in terms of the work of Toni Morrison and others, as to how to deal with the legacy of the past. And I think in Iraq that's very important, and that's what I try to do in some of the writing, but also in the last novel, which is called The Book of Collateral Damage, because it is about an Iraqi in New York who is grappling with how to write the politics, about writing about a country that you are no longer living in without appropriating the voices of those who are living there, but also an Iraqi bookseller in Baghdad who wants to write the history of what the war destroys, not just statistics and human beings, but possibilities of lives and all of these objects. In a way, what you showed also what has happened to the space of this country called Iraq, or how one is an Iraqi or a Baghdadi, which has completely been disfigured and destroyed. And even for purely instrumental political reasons, dealing with the past and reminding ourselves that none of this was inevitable, and that other ways of living in Iraq and being Iraqi were possible and can still be possible in the future. Wassalamu alaikum.
Okay, so now we will.
I'm sorry.
Now we'll open it up to questions or comments. We have a lot of time. We're not actually expected to go all the way till 4, but we do have time. So any of the panelists can elaborate on anything that people would like to hear more about, or if you have brief comments yourself. Yes, Aaron.
I have a question about the Kurt Locker is not being an anti-war film.
علي صوتك.
I was wondering.
Speak up.
Sorry, can't hear me.
No.
The idea of Kurt Locker being not really being a proper anti-war film, but in the history of American cinema, what you would consider to be a proper anti-war film, considering most of the problems that are related to the Kurt Locker are also true about Apocalypse Now or any of these kind of films. So is it a sort of lack of American cultural production or something specific to Iraq?
No, you're right. I mean, there is redacted, and just yesterday we were talking to Zahra, the other Zahra, about how redacted. Oh, no, it's This is the problem of the settler colonial imaginary and the constant amnesia and eternal American innocence. I agree with you, and that's the same thing with Apocalypse Now. Terry, I forgot her last name, has written an excellent article about American films about Iraq. But it is part of the, we're talking about Iraq, but it's the same thing with Vietnam and other places in various degrees. What's his name was the head of the American Motion Picture Association, had a great quote about saying how Washington and Hollywood have the same DNA, and which is true. So of course you might find an independent film here or there, but in Hollywood, and that's what you're going to get, the liberal narrative about Iraq and other places where Americans went to do good things. حتى الماكدونالدز ما فتحوا.
يا ريت لو فاتحين بس
I do have a question. Oh, okay. Okay, go ahead, then we'll go there.
Do you feel there's any responsibility for people who are working with filmmakers in terms of Iraqi filmmakers representing or reflecting an image about Iraq, integrating?
Is that for me or?
For, I guess.
We can. It's a general question.
Yeah, it is a general.
Sorry, I'll just say
we
something
can all comment
briefly that I wanted to talk about. What I meant about writers and artists, because of the demands of the market, but because of internalizing this discourse about Iraq, end up primarily reproducing the image that is going to be legible. So there is this problematic focus on, for example, minorities, because that's what's going to sell. I'm not saying that minority discourse and problems don't need to be explored, but reproducing, frankly, overwhelmingly Orientalist tropes, because these are the ones that are marketable and that are legible. This happens elsewhere. There are all these debates about African literature in English and African literature written there, and the same thing with filmmakers. And there are very few resources, but also it's the market. The market demands. Some of them have the independence and the resilience to resist the allure of wanting a larger audience, but something that's going to complicate how people see Iraq is not going to. Producers are not going to look kindly upon that.
I want to add something to this, and I think so I think one of the main what we always kind of have problems with is this kind of politics of representation, that we are always worried about how Iraq could be misrepresented or presented misrepresented in a way that it promotes a certain kind of ideological hegemony of what empire is, and I think that's kind of very important point to make. But for me also, there is something that has to do not only with politics of representation, but with this obsession with politics of recognition, that we're constantly trying to speak with empire to recognize that it hurt us.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I am not interested in seeking any recognition. I am interested in trying to turn my eyes into what kind of life exists in Iraq, what kind of things that I could write about, something that I could find to be horrendous or something that could be so beautiful at the same time. So my interest is, I think maybe we need to have less of this seeking recognition from power, and actually kind of set that away and say, listen, I'm not. This is a futile project. What do I want? I want the American media to have a great representation about Iraq. Why is that? If you are an Iraqi, you're a filmmaker, you make a great representation about Iraq. You tell a good human story about Iraq. And I think films could be good films or bad films, Good films because they're thought through a certain kind of framework. You have a great story, everything works together. So I think we need to look at these issues beyond this idea of that we need to be recognized that all of this has happened, and I struggle with, like Sinan, with these ideas. Do I really want to keep telling Americans what they did in Iraq, or I just need to turn my head and just begin to believe that I am a researcher who is writing about some things that I feel very puzzled by also, because a lot of these stuff are mysteries when you begin to try to understand what exactly the relationship between these things. So I think this took us a while to, at least for me, it took me a while to kind of overcome some of these problems of like, oh, this is Orientalist, oh, this is blah blah blah. This is like, I think I mean, I don't necessarily need to seek that kind of recognition. But I think your question is important because we all have this potential of doing something, and the question is for us. I think the question here is what we can do.
Can I say something briefly? It's not about recognition. The problem is we can't underestimate how actually images produce. I mean, that's why I write in Arabic, because my primary audience is in Iraq and the Arab world. I'm not interested in changing minds of Americans necessarily. But the films that are produced and the media that's produced nowadays here is consumed right away by Iraqis there and others. So their self-image is produced as much in the Anglophone metropolitan world, and that's why this is a place of intervention, not to get recognition from empire, but to challenge and to disrupt these global images that are circulating. You have to engage with the centers of power, not to get recognition, but to change.
I just want to say something about that, because when it comes to women and gender or feminism, I mean, there have been so many things, written about, women in Iraq, as, victims, etc., victims of the sanctions, victims of the invasion, etc., because, of course, the colonial, the colonial gender narrative that accompanied, the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq was so important. So I totally understand the need for many scholars, for many feminists to actually address and also, target white colonial feminists, for their complicity with the war, etc., etc. But when I started researching, I really wanted to write on something else, basically. I wanted to, talk about actually, instead of, it's exactly what I had in mind in the sense that, okay, I'm not going to tell you about, how basically the U.S. or the narratives around Iraq, produced, oppression, etc. I mean, this is okay, part of the narrative. Some people are working on that, and that's great. What I want to do is really, collect oral histories of women, observe the everyday lives in Baghdad and in other places, to see, what's going on beyond this. Also because the first thing that I also noticed when I started doing fieldwork is that there is really, and it's still the case, I mean, when I started it was almost 10 years ago, and it's still very much the case, and I think it's very important that we actually reflect on that, is that there is a gap between discourse, everything that is written, etc., outside Iraq and inside Iraq. I think outside Iraq it's really about, talking to, the empire, right, criticizing the US, etc. Inside Iraq, the debate is very different. I mean, even when it comes to feminism, even when it comes to, political activism, like statement like, imperialism, it's completely irrelevant in actual social and political activism inside Iraq. It's irrelevant, right? I remember when I started my fieldwork, especially in Kurdistan and in Iraqi Kurdistan, Erbil and Slemani, and I wanted, for example, to talk about the invasion, and straight away after 1 second I was like, this is not the relevant question. We're gonna talk about something else. That doesn't mean that people are right. That I'm not falling into people from the inside are right, have the right agenda, and people from the outside have the wrong agenda. This is not the debate, but it's, how can we complicate this? How can we, of course it's very complicated. Every time I talk about Iraq, I'm puzzled. Even in the way I write, even in my book, I'm always puzzled. I want to show that we have strong feminists. I want to show that we have, strong women, that we have a rich history. But at the same time, I want to talk about the destruction. I want to talk about, how patriarchy is terrible, how, etc., etc. So how it's really difficult to, to actually provide the two at the same time, right? And also to be aware of the fact when I was writing my book, I wrote the book really for the feminist that I studied, for the feminist and the woman activist with whom I spent so long. Like I participated to the activities for like 2 years, and I was like, this book I wanted to talk to them, but at the same time I'm publishing it with Cambridge University Press. It's a book in English. It's going to talk to, of course, it's being translated, but first of all, when it came out, it's going to talk to an outside audience. So how can I write in a way that can contribute to both audience? And how can I perhaps acknowledge the impossibility of talking to both audience? So maybe that's a conversation that we should carry on having.
Did you have anything on this? Okay, on the white shirt message. Yeah.
I'm been asking about it from the Century Foundation. Thanks for these great remarks. You allude to, I think, two almost completely unrelated conversations. And the one is that I think you're less interested in is the American conversation, in which Iraq was always just a prop, right? So whatever happened to Iraq or Iraqis, like also what happened later to Syrians, was only relevant in pro-war, anti-war, anti-Bush, pro-Obama, or whatever your agenda was. And although that's not your project, I think it is always worth complicating that conversation and reminding Americans that this isn't whatever, this isn't an internal discussion, but it's something that has real consequences in the world, which then have blowback, which is, I think, its own fascinating field of study. And to Sinan's observation, I went back to Baghdad after almost 10 years away a few years ago and resumed research there. And the first thing that visually shocked me was, as I came into the city, I thought the Americans were back. And as I got closer, I saw it was Iraqi security forces in American Humvees, American-style uniforms, the wraparound shades, the whole visual architecture of the occupation, now appropriated by, militias, soldiers, police, all these different entities. And once I got over that visual shock, of course, their behavior in some cases was entirely different than the Americans. Was friendly, nice. In other cases, even more predatory. But that was a real illustration of how agency, in a lot of ways, has gone back to Iraq and to Iraqis. And that's something that I didn't hear too much in your remarks. But my impression, returning to Iraq, is that so many things are happening, good and bad, that have nothing to do with Iran, America, outside powers. Yes, these outside powers affect everything that happens to some extent, but there really is a political conversation, a cultural conversation, even the awful predatory economics of the militias. These are things with momentum and agency that are bringing in, I would say, a lot of portions of Iraqi society that until recently were actively excluded, and I don't think we understand it. I don't think even Iraqis who study various aspects of this are yet, they're still mapping it, they're still understanding who's making money, who is controlling these media stations, who's doing this, that, and the other. And I won't say it's a vibrant, creative, thousand flowers blooming, wonderful thing, but it's a thing that I think is very alive and maybe more dynamic than any country in the region today. And so it's not quite a question, but it's sort of not malignant or not. There's energy to it, and I think only Omar really spoke to that. So I throw that out there.
Yeah, just to reiterate this, I think I'm more interested in what stories Iraq could tell. And then these stories need to have people's attention to what's going on. And I think Zahra's, for example, Zahra's amazing book. It starts with this idea of like, where are the women in the street? And that's kind of the first observation. It's like, why? And then she goes on to write a book about women. It kind of starts from that limit of like, why is this not available? Why is it not there? What happened to this thing? And then kind of goes on and kind of disentangle a lot of these questions in terms of the way that she interviewed women and looked at the everyday life and all of these issues. So in a way, these limits are always could be very much productive here. And then how you turn them into a story And I think this is mostly what we need, is to understand learn about what kind of life people dwell in Iraq. I think this is the kind of questions.
Can I briefly say that of course Iraqi society is very dynamic, definitely. It's amazing, of course, because 65% of the population of Iraq are people under the age of 30 or something. But I would be very wary of the type of discourse that say that there were previously groups that are now included. I spent 8 days in Iraq, and I tried as much as possible, but the number of people who are economically excluded and completely desperate is humongous. I mean, so of course there are these malls, but the gap between the malls and the rest of the city, the number of children begging,
The ghettos.
the ghettos, so I would be, the problem is trying to somehow find some positive aspect to post-occupation is very problematic for me. Yes, of course, now Iraqis have the agency, but this entire landscape, America mothered this situation in Iraq, and it's not out there, it's still there, and it's still very complicated and back and forth between Iran and the US. But actually, I don't want to bring you anecdotes, but a lot of the people feel very excluded because they can't even afford to go. So the book fair was great that I attended, but was misleading because of course there's a certain class of people that have wherewithal, and I was surprised by Shara Saadun had so many tourist agencies, and I asked around, and of course there are people who are benefiting from the socioeconomic system, but the hundreds and thousands of people, whether in Baghdad, on the outskirts, or in Basra, have no stay, and feel that nothing. And it's very, very, very bleak. It's very difficult to be optimistic, and it's irresponsible to be optimistic, I think.
Yes, thank you for that.
Sure. I mean, thanks for the question, Francis. I struggled whether to, so I I take your point. I understand where you're coming from on the question. I think it's, I think, and you're familiar with the foreign press in Baghdad. You've been there, for years. You spent a lot of time there during, in the early years of the occupation, and have been covering it after. And I think a challenge for some of the journalists and some of the foreign people who are covering these spaces is, as much as they're trying to show the changes in everyday life in Baghdad, they're actually missing some of the more important aspects. So rather, and I think this is what I was trying to capture a little bit, at least. And if we turn to, for example, there's been a lot of coverage around one particular social entrepreneurship site in Baghdad that opened about a year ago or so, and it's beautiful and glitzy and nice, and has like co-working spaces and like all these things that seem like, oh yeah, I understand what this is. Right, and then gets picked up by, I can't count how many foreign embassies have made a formal visit to that one particular site. I'm holding it up as this space that we can show and highlight progress. Nobody talks about, frankly. I mean, this is, maybe we don't have to. I know it's being taped. We don't have to air this later online. But nobody talks about who funded it. Right? Nobody talks about who funded that site. Particular private bank. From which private banks have run kind of roughshod over, Iraqi's economic, banking system, and really been the source, as the source of some of the worst corruption and funneling out of dollars the country has, and so and nobody talks about it, right? And in defense of, now, let me just